Ever stop and think about what actually goes on behind the scenes to make sure big companies or even charities run the right way, ethically and effectively? That's really the big question we're tackling today. We're going deep into how organizations are governed, specifically looking at these two big ideas, doing things by the rules versus following principles. We'll see how that plays out differently, company to company, country to country. We've got some great sources here. And the plan is to cut through the jargon and give you a really clear picture of what this all means.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because these aren't just abstract concepts for lawyers or academics. They genuinely shape things like whether investors feel safe putting their money into a company, or even just how businesses operate day to day. We're going to look at the real-world fallout of picking one path over the other, and also this whole global push to get everyone sort of on the same page.
Okay, so let's start right there with that core difference. Our sources map out these two main roads for governance codes. First up, the rules-based approach. Sounds pretty self-explanatory, right?
It does. Think of it like a very strict legal code. The rules-based way, like you see with Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX in the U.S., basically writes the governance code straight into law. There are very clear legal requirements, line by line, and if you break them, well, there are serious penalties, often criminal ones. The whole idea is clarity, standardization. Everyone knows exactly where they stand. It's meant to be a level playing field.
Right, crystal clear. But then the UK takes a different tack, doesn't it? More principles-based, you called it. That sounds, well, fuzzier?
Maybe a little less black and white, yeah. It's more about following the spirit of the code, not just the exact wording. The key phrase here is comply or explain. A company either follows the code's recommendations or it has to publicly state why it isn't, usually in its report to shareholders and regulators. Now, there's still legal backing through things like stock exchange listing rules, but the philosophy, the core thinking, is different. It definitely begs the question, does that flexibility actually lead to better, smarter governance, or just, excuses?
That comply or explain idea is really interesting. And our sources gave a perfect example of this in action, didn't they? Marks and Spencer back in 2008. What went down there?
Yes, M&S. So in 2008, they appointed Sir Stuart Rose as executive chairman. Now, that meant he was both CEO and chairman. That directly went against the UK Corporate Governance Code, which generally advises splitting those roles to avoid too much power in one person's hands.
Okay, so they broke the rule. The principle, rather.
Exactly. And on top of that, they apparently didn't properly consult their major shareholders beforehand, which is another sort of procedural expectation in the code.
So how did they handle being non-compliant? Did they just kind of hope nobody noticed?
Oh, not at all. This is where comply or explain kicks in. In their annual report that year, M&S were very upfront. They stated clearly that they weren't complying with those two specific provisions, and then, crucially, they explained why. They laid out their reasoning, even sent a letter directly to shareholders. Basically, here's what we did, here's our justification, now it's up to you, the owners, to judge.
Wow. So they put the ball squarely in the shareholders' court.
Precisely. It's a perfect illustration. Shareholders had to decide if the explanation was good enough. Which, highlights both the transparency aspect, but also the challenge, right? Investors need to be able to assess those reasons properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. It puts a real responsibility on the shareholders to be informed and engaged, doesn't it? Maybe more so than in a strict rule system.
It absolutely does. It relies on, let's say, sophisticated investors and clear explanations. And zooming out, this choice between rules and principles for a whole country, it's not made in a vacuum. It depends on so much. Who typically owns companies, banks, families, lots of small shareholders? What's the legal system like? The government, the economy, the culture, even how much foreign investment flows in. These national flavors run deep. So even with global standards emerging, the actual practice of governance often stays quite local. It reflects history, values.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So we have these two basic models. Let's quickly run through the arguments, the pros and cons for each, based on what our sources say. For rules-based, what are the big selling points?
Well, the arguments for rules are pretty clear-cut. First, clarity. It's law, no gray areas. Second, standardization. Everyone follows the same playbook, which seems fair. Third, those binding requirements. They have teeth, often criminal ones, which is a strong deterrent. And all that leads to, hopefully, greater confidence that companies are actually complying. Security, predictability.
Makes sense. But nothing's perfect. What's the downside of being so rigid? which I guess are the arguments for the principles approach.
Exactly. There's always a trade-off. One big risk with super detailed laws is that they can encourage a kind of loophole mentality. People look for ways around the rules, not ways to embrace the spirit. You might get compliance on paper, but no real buy-in from companies, just box ticking.
Checklist approach, yeah.
Right. And you lose flexibility. A rule might not make sense for a small startup versus a giant multinational, but the law applies equally. Our sources also mention regulation overload, just the sheer cost and bureaucracy for companies and regulators. And maybe counterintuitively, it can limit improvement. Why go above and beyond the minimum legal standard if there's no incentive?
That checklist idea really resonates. So, speaking of rules having teeth, you mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley in the U.S. That piece of legislation feels like a watershed moment, born out of some pretty major scandals.
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk rules-based governance without talking SOX. The Enron and WorldCom collapses in 2001, 2002. I mean, these were seismic shocks. Enron was huge, top 10 in the U.S. When it went bankrupt, it triggered this wave of fear, people called it Enronitis, that rippled through markets everywhere. Investor confidence just plummeted. SOX name for Senator Sarbanes and Representative Oxley was Washington's answer. And it was tough, detailed, rules-based with a vengeance, backed by the full force of law. Deadlines were set, no messing around.
So, Enron implodes, trust evaporates, and Congress steps in with SOX. What did it actually do? What were the key changes it forced on companies?
Well, first, it applied broadly U.S.-listed companies, their subsidiaries, directors, even their auditors. And it really hammered home personal accountability. CEOs and CFOs suddenly had to personally sign off, certifying the accuracy of financial statements to the SEC. If things were restated later due to noncompliance, they'd have to forfeit bonuses. Real consequences.
So no more hiding behind the corporate structure.
Pretty much. It also put tight restrictions on auditors, limiting the non-audit work they could do for a client, forcing partner rotation every 5 years, trying to break up those potentially cozy relationships. It set up a new watchdog, the Public Company Oversight Board, to police accounting standards, made companies disclose off-balance sheet deals better, stopped directors trading shares at sensitive times. It was sweeping.
And you mentioned one part, Section 404, was particularly significant and costly.
Section 404, yes. That became almost synonymous with SOX for many companies, especially the cost aspect. It required both management and the external auditors to issue statements on how good the company's internal controls over financial reporting were. Think about that. Management has to say, yes, our controls work, and then the auditor has to audit that assessment and issue their own report.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Huge amount. Documenting processes, testing controls. It was and is an enormous effort. And the kicker, a lot of the cost is fixed, meaning it hits smaller companies disproportionately hard. They didn't have armies of internal auditors like the giants.
Like asking that small bakery to have the same paperwork as a giant food factory? The principle's good, but the scale of the burden is way different.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlighted that disproportionate impact. So yeah, SOX was massive. Looking back, what were the big picture effects, positive and negative? On the plus side, it definitely helped restore some investor confidence, no question. It forced companies to take internal controls and external audits more seriously. It created more distance between companies and their auditors, strengthened audit committees, and that personal liability for directors. That was a major, major shift.
Okay, so some real positives in terms of accountability and transparency. But what about the downsides? The grumbling we heard about cost and red tape.
Oh, the grumbling was loud. Audit fees basically doubled for many companies. The sheer cost and effort of Section 404 documentation was immense. Critics argued it made companies less flexible, less nimble, maybe even less willing to take necessary risks. Some felt it stifled competitiveness. And there was debate about whether it actually stopped future abuses or just set a legal minimum, that checklist floor, rather than fostering a truly ethical culture.
Right, the floor versus the ceiling argument. So our focus so far has been largely on these big, publicly traded companies. But governance isn't just for them, is it? What about other types of organizations like NGOs or smaller private firms?
That's a crucial point. Let's take NGOs, charities. A big trend there is this push towards increased commercialization, running the charity more like a business, being super efficient with donations and grants, getting the most impact for the money, sometimes bringing in directors from the corporate world to help with that.
Makes sense. Donors want efficiency. But I can imagine that creates some tension, right? A clash between the mission-driven heart of a charity and the hard-nosed business approach.
Exactly. It's a real culture clash you often see on NGO boards. How do you balance serving a social need with, say, hitting financial targets or making tough commercial decisions? You might have an anti-industry bias among some staff or board members, a heavy reliance on volunteers who might lack specific business skills, maybe even some fuzziness around the core mission itself. Our sources talk about boards sometimes having this parental devotional view, which can make it hard to implement rigorous business-like governance. It requires a really careful balancing act.
That's a really insightful point about the unique challenges NGOs face. What about smaller private companies, the limited companies? Are their governance issues just scaled-down versions of the big guys?
Sort of, but with some key differences. The classic agency problem managers potentially not acting in the owner's best interest is often less severe. Why? Because usually the owners are the managers or are very closely involved. Shareholding is restricted. But they still have governance challenges unique to their scale. Things like, what's the right role for non-executive directors? Or how many do you need? How big should the board be? Do you need formal audit or nomination committees? These can be tough calls for smaller outfits with limited resources. Still, the general feeling, according to our sources, is that good governance practices are beneficial for all companies, improving communication and trust, maybe through things like a formal business review process.
Okay, and digging deeper into ownership, our sources bring up this really fundamental difference seen around the world. Family-owned firms versus the more typical joint stock companies with dispersed shareholders, sometimes called insider versus outsider dominated.
Yeah, that's a huge distinction globally. Research highlighted by our sources, like Laporta's study back in '99 across nearly 50 countries, found that widespread share ownership wasn't actually the norm for large companies. Only about 24% had that structure. A whopping 35% were family-controlled. Think big names like Walmart, historically Cadbury.
So family firms are really common. What are the governance upsides there?
Well, fewer agency costs. As we said, the family's wealth is tied up in the company. There can be a strong ethical dimension. Damaging the company's reputation damages the family name, the family honor. And often there's a real long-term perspective. They're thinking about generations, not just the next quarterly report.
That sounds pretty good. Fewer conflicts, long-term view, but surely there are downsides too. Family dynamics can be complicated.
Absolutely. That's the flip side. The gene pool issue is the next generation always the best equipped to lead? Maybe not. Internal family squabbles can spill over and poison the business. And when family members want out, separations or buyouts can be incredibly messy and expensive.
And this idea extends beyond just families, right? To these broader insider-dominated structures.
Exactly. Think places like Japan or Germany, where it's common for listed companies to be controlled by a tight group. Could be founding families, could be banks, other corporations, even the government sometimes. The potential benefits are similar. Less agency conflict, maybe cheaper access to capital because the controlling shareholders are stable, a long-term strategic view, better communication between owners and managers.
But the risks.
Big ones. Minority shareholders can get overlooked or railroaded. Operations might lack transparency, seem opaque from the outside. There's potential for misuse of power, like maybe being reluctant to hire talented outsiders for top jobs. And it's harder for unhappy shareholders to just sell their shares and vote with their feet if the controlling group is entrenched. These kinds of companies, historically, often didn't rush to adopt formal governance codes until external pressures mounted.
Right, so you have all these different national traditions, different ownership models. It makes you wonder how effective any global push for standardized governance can really be. Seems like trying to fit square pegs into round holes sometimes. But despite those differences, there is a strong push for international standards, isn't there? Especially as markets become more globalized.
Definitely. Money flows across borders. Companies list on foreign stock exchanges. Investors operate globally. So having some common ground, some shared expectations around governance just makes sense. It's similar to the push we saw for international accounting standards.
And who's been leading that charge?
Well, the European Union has been quite active. Back in 2003, the EU Commission put out an action plan with recommendations for companies listed in the EU. That led to directives requiring things like an annual governance statement using comply or explain, and clarifying board responsibilities for disclosure. And they kept refining it. A public consultation in 2011 shows it's an ongoing process. Of course, directives need embedding in each country's laws.
And beyond the EU.
The Commonwealth countries have also been very influential, especially for developing economies. The King Report out of South Africa in 1994 was a real catalyst. Good governance is seen as vital for attracting investment and building strong national capital markets. That led to the Commonwealth Association for Corporate Governance, the CKG, in '98. They developed principles specifically with emerging markets in mind.
So regional efforts, Commonwealth efforts. Are there any truly global codes aiming for worldwide application?
Yes, our sources point to two main players here: the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and the International Corporate Governance Network, or ICGN. The OECD, which includes both developed and developing countries, published its Principles of Corporate Governance in 2004. This was really the first big intergovernmental effort to lay out core governance elements. The goal was to help governments improve their own rules and guide stock exchanges, investors, companies. They focus mainly on publicly traded firms, but note the principles are useful for others too. They cover the basics: effective frameworks, shareholder rights, stakeholder roles, transparency, board duties, kind of a foundational text.
Okay, the OECD sets a baseline. What about the ICGN? How are they different?
The ICGN comes at it from a slightly different angle. It was founded in '95 by big institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers. So it represents the people actually putting money into these companies, along with academics and companies themselves. Their principles, updated in 2005, basically spell out what ICGN members look for when making investment decisions. Again, focused on traded companies, but relevant beyond. They often go a bit further, are seen as more rigorous than some other codes. They cover a lot. Shareholder returns as the objective, disclosure, audit, detailed shareholder rights and voting, boards, pay, ethics, stakeholder relations, implementation. It's very comprehensive, driven by investor demands.
These sound like serious efforts to build global consensus. But you hinted before there are limitations, right? How much real power do these international codes have?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How effective can codes be if they're essentially voluntary? Unless a country takes the OECD or ICGN principles and writes them into their own national laws, they aren't legally enforceable. Their power comes from reputation, from market pressure, from investors like those in the ICGN saying, "We expect this." And then there's the issue we keep coming back to. Local context matters. Those deep-rooted differences in ownership structures mean some parts of a global code might just not fit or be relevant everywhere.
So it's not a magic bullet. Harmonization is a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. It's a constant process of negotiation, adaptation, trying to find that balance between global standards and local realities.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive. We've covered a huge amount of ground, from that fundamental split between rules and principles, the shockwaves of SOX after Enron, the specific governance worlds of family firms and NGOs, right through to this global push for common standards led by the OECD and ICGN.
Yeah, we've seen it all, haven't we? Whether it's pages of detailed law or a set of guiding principles, the end goal seems to be the same: building trust, making sure there's accountability, helping organizations run effectively. But getting there, that involves this constant balancing act: rigidity versus flexibility, local ways versus global norms, sticking to the letter versus embracing the spirit. It's complex.
So thinking about all this, what's the takeaway for you listening in? Well, next time you see a news story about a company's big decision, or maybe, unfortunately, another corporate scandal, perhaps look a little deeper. Ask yourself, what kind of governance system is likely at play here? Is it strict rules? Or is it principles with that comply or explain idea? And how might that basic philosophy be shaping their actions, their transparency, their ultimate success or failure? Makes you think, doesn't it? What kind of system at the end of the day do you believe builds the strongest, most trustworthy organizations for our future? Organizations for our future.